Oh, you're there. Oh, sorry. Guess we should get going on Cold War lecture. Americans faced a lot of uncertainties after World War II. Remember Henry Luce in the American Century said the United States is going to have to be the Good Samaritan of the whole world. Images coming out of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, maybe called that into question a little bit. It is interesting that the United States at this time is one of the high points in thinking the United States is a Christian nation in our history, and yet these are the kind of images coming out of decisions the United States made, for instance, to use atomic weapons against Japan. So the nature of America's moral leadership in the world was certainly something that was in question, but that's not the question on American policymakers' minds. They were more concerned about the economic question. Remember, Luce had said in his article, he kind of outlined four things the United States needed to do to make the 20th century the American century. And the first on the list was economics. The United States needed to ensure free enterprise everywhere in the world. And then he continued, we know perfectly well there's not the slightest chance of anything faintly resembling a free economic system prevailing in this country if it prevails nowhere else. What Luce is essentially saying is you can't have capitalism in just one country. Why? Why can't you have capitalism in just one country? Why does the United States need to rebuild in other countries? Take a second to think about it. And you're right, it's the problem of overproduction again. Luce and many Americans felt Americans had kind of lost sight of that during the 1920s, certainly during the 1930s, when we thought we could become the American turtle. And we needed to get back to that Charles Conant economic basis of imperialism kind of thinking regarding the American economy and its integration, if not interdependence, with other economies around the world. The future of the U.S. economy was dependent upon the future of other countries' economies, particularly the economies of our chief trading partners, Western Europe. As we've talked about already, the New Deal did not bring America out of the Great Depression. Spending on World War II did. Putting millions of Americans back to work or newly to work in America's defense industries and building the arsenal of democracy, all those weapons of little and mass destruction, is what brought about economic recovery. Of course, the question becomes, now that the war is winding down, what's going to keep that employment high, running full? The ideal of the 1940s was called full employment. And the United States during World War II achieved, for practical purposes, full employment. How do we maintain that in a post-war environment? This is the question, and for a lot of Americans, it was for a number of policymakers, should I say? I don't say all Americans, but for a lot of Americans, it was having to rebuild America's export base. Policymakers thought we needed to get back to 1920s levels. 1920s, we were probably exporting 10% of our gross domestic product. And American policymakers are saying we need to, in order to keep the American economy running full, in order to convert to peacetime and yet keep all these millions of Americans at work, we need to get back to that level of exporting to other countries. Of course, what's the problem with the world in 1945? It's the same, theoretically, but much worse of a problem, say, than after World War One. After World War One, other countries were, in different ways, still buying American products. What about World War II? Most of the world, including the people that we want to be trading with, are laying in ruins. And so, again, the question becomes, American economic expansion becomes a question of what role should government play in enabling that. Remember, Lewis is saying here, you can't have free economic system in just one country. What can the U.S. government do to stimulate? What can the U.S. government do to help recover America's chief trading partners so that we can rebuild our export base and thus keep Americans at full employment, keep the American economic machine running at its unprecedentedly high capacity. And so ultimately the question of Americans' economic future was tied up with the role of the U.S. government in stimulating economic redevelopment in other countries, which is why the United States takes a lead, even more so than it did in World War I, takes a lead in, you could use different terms for this, internationalism, but the buzzword in the 1940s was globalism. The United States takes a lead in globalism. That's the first time this word global is being used or enters the English vocabulary. The United States is at the forefront of globalism because we feel that we need to be so for our own self-interest, but we also believe it's in the world's best interest as well, too. So the League of Nations is largely laying in shambles. It wasn't that efficacious anyways, with the United States not being officially a part of it, but with the actions of Germany and Japan during during the 1930s and into World War II, the League of Nations is effectively dead. It's FDR in 1941 who proposes to Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of England, that they begin to launch a new United Nations. And so it's early 1941, United States. We're barely even in the war, and the United States is already saying, all right, how can we rebuild a sense of international political military collaboration? Because the United States can already understands, like Luce, that we're going to have to play a role beyond just kind of economic internationalism. We're going to have to play a more political and military entangled role, if you will, after this war is over. The United Nations will officially be launched in San Francisco in 1945, but in many ways, the most important foundation for the United Nations really came in 1944 at the Bretton Woods Conference. You see a picture there of the conference at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. You also see a picture there of John Maynard Keynes. We've talked about Keynesianism in here. Keynes was a huge influence for the British and American perspective at this conference. So at Bretton Woods, anticipating the United Nations formation, 44 countries come together to talk about what the post-war world should look like in economic terms. Ultimately, Bretton Woods will develop three major developments come out of the Bretton Woods agreements. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund. The IMF, some of IMF's job was giving out money for reconstruction, for development, but the main goal of the IMF was to stabilize currency exchange. And we've talked about that. One of the reasons that trade ground to a halt, international trade ground to a halt in the 1930s, was because we could agree on what's the dollar versus the pound versus the franc versus the mark. And so the IMF had the goal of currency stabilization. The United States took a lead on this. In absence of a gold standard, the United States made the U.S. dollar essentially became the de facto global currency, and all other currencies were measured by the U.S. dollar or backed by the U.S. dollar. So the United States is taking an active lead in this case, completely opposite, right? Remember FDR's bombshell letter? Everybody does their own thing. The IMF and U.S. leadership in the IMF suggests we've kind of learned our lesson. We're not going to be Peter Parker. We're going to be Spider-Man. We're going to do everything we can to ensure an economic global order, because we believe it's in our best interest, but the world's best interest too. The creation of the IBRD, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. The IBRD, think of it very much in Keynesian terms. How can you bring an economy that has been ruined by war, such as England's or Germany's or France's economies, how can you bring them back? You can stimulate development through low interest or low interest loans or just grants, gifts. And so that's what the IBRD, it provided loans for reconstruction of war-torn countries and also for development of the quote, the so-called quote backward countries. Yeah, most IBRD money came from the United States because we are the country that had the money to give. Again, the United States is engaging in this kind of global Keynesian program with the hope that we could stimulate redevelopment, reconstruction, particularly in Western Europe, because Western Europe, again, are the places where the United States wants to begin to export its goods, as we had in the 1920s. Most of our export goods in the 1920s went to Europe, and we're hoping to recover that at this time. And then finally, GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. GATT was trying to establish, think of GATT as the rules for an NFL football game, right? If nobody knows what a catch is, a touchdown is, a pass interference penalty, if we don't establish those rules beforehand, how could you play the game of football? It'd be chaos. Before there can be international trade, somebody has to establish the rules of the playing field, and that's what GATT intends to do. It intends to establish the rules for how countries are going to be able to work with each other. Tariffs are taxes on foreign goods. We've talked about this. High tariff, a country is trying to protect its industries, trying to get people to buy nationally. GATT intended to lower tariffs. It's very GATT would be probably the equivalent of Wilson's 14 points from World War I. The 14 points were intended to create a world which would have an open door for American goods to go through in terms of low tariffs. GATT is intended to try to establish the same kind of world, a low tariff world, so that goods could flow freely, and particularly that American goods could flow freely around the world. We are, in some ways, again, looking to grow fat off of Europe's folly. Japan's, I guess, too. Why is it important to understand the Bretton Woods Agreement? Long term, in many ways, we still live in the Bretton Woods world. The International Monetary Fund is still the International Monetary Fund today. The IBRD is now the World Bank. But it still does the same thing. It provides money for reconstruction and development. And GATT no longer exists. In 1995, it became the World Trade Organization, a more dynamic body, but with the same goals of facilitating global trade, keeping tariffs low, and on and on. In many ways, the Bretton Woods system of a kind of globally integrated network of free enterprise capitalist economies that we envisioned in 1944 is in many ways still the world. It's the last 10 years or so that's been challenged around the world, even in the United States to some extent. But largely, we still live in the Bretton Woods world. In the short term, Bretton Woods is good to understand, is because it shows how the United States is, certainly in political ways, trying to guarantee its economic future. It's trying to to use the Keynesian term, stimulate or fast track global recovery, but really European recovery, so that the American economy can continue to run at full speed by beginning to export more of its goods. Problem is, it doesn't work. American export goods, as we transition from 1945 to 1946, 1946, and 1947, it's not happening. We're actually going the opposite direction. We had estimations of trying to hit 10% of exporting our gross domestic product. In 1947, 1948, we're around 2%. We're exporting 2% of our gross domestic product, and it's going the other way. Why? Is it because the world doesn't want to buy American goods? Europe doesn't want to buy American goods? No, they didn't have the money. Reconstruction is not happening there. Keynesianism, that speeding up strategy is not, it's not working for different reasons. So the world's not buying American, which casts the American economy and future. I mean, we can't keep making weapons of little and mass destruction forever, right? At some point, we have to convert to a peacetime economy. We can't be a permanent war economy, right? Let's put a pin in that. And so the great uncertainty for the United States was how do we keep our economy running at full speed? We understand that that was ultimately a question of international and global politics. We are trying to take a lead to the United Nations and the Bretton Woods Agreement. And as we enter 2-3 years out from World War II, it's not happening. And so a great question mark lies over America's economic future and economic stability. Another question, though, at the same time, was would the Soviet Union stand in the way of America's economic ambitions? As we try to follow the Henry Luce blueprint of rebuilding free enterprise, free economies around the world, as we follow the Henry Wallace blueprint of helping other people, assisting other people to develop. You know, maybe you're seeing Luce and Wallace in some ways agreeing on the need for the United States to help other countries. I'm not sure how you're reading those two together. But as the United States is looking to, whether for their own interest or for other people's interests, are looking to develop and redevelop free enterprise in other countries, will the Soviet Union stand in our way? And it's a great question mark. We just don't know. It's true, during World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union were allies. So you would think that that could have continued on after World War II. And there were many Americans who thought that it should. Uncle Joe Stalin was pretty popular in the United States during the war years for the Soviet resistance to the Nazi war machine. Nevertheless, neither side really came to trust each other, even though we were on the same side of this war. So let me explain a little bit. When did World War II begin? And if you've been doing your homework, you say, oh, it's 1931 when Japan invaded Manchuria. Yes, in many ways that's true. But when did World War II begin in Europe? You say, oh, that's when the that's when the Nazis invaded Poland. Close. Actually, a week before that, when the Soviets and the Germans signed a non-aggression pact. Here, Hitler and Stalin signed a non-aggression pact, essentially saying we're not going to aggress against each other, we're not going to attack each other. They also agreed to carve up Eastern Europe. And so the non-aggression pact is not just an anti-war pact between these two states, it's also an imperial pact. The Soviets will take this, the Germans will take this, and of course Germany claimed Poland, and a week later, Hitler, now knowing the Soviets were not going to attack, having secured that the Soviets will not attack Hitler for invading Poland, Hitler invades Poland, and World War II begins in the European theater. So the United States, they never really trust the Soviet Union all through this war, because they believe that after this war is over, the Soviets still are going to have designs on Eastern Europe. They're going to look to expand the borders of the Soviet Union beyond Russia. And the Soviets and Stalin just can't be trusted. And as the Red Army, as we move into 43, 44, 45, and the Red Army is spread throughout Eastern Europe, is spread into Germany, Americans only become more and more mistrustful of the Soviets. But we don't exactly give the Soviets reason to trust us either. So the United States enters into the war in late 1941, 1942. Immediately, the big three begin meeting: Churchill, Stalin, and FDR. Stalin immediately asks for Churchill and FDR to open up a second front to essentially invade France. Why? Because at this time, by 1942, the Germans have invaded the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is at war. It's getting ground down by the Nazi war machine. Look, how many Americans died in World War II? Around 400,000 or 500,000 U.S. deaths. How many Soviets died in World War II? It's 30 million, 10 million soldiers and 20 million civilians. It had everything to do with the Soviets just through body after body after body resisting the advance of the German war machine. To take the pressure off of the Soviet Union, Stalin quite reasonably says, hey, could you guys open up a second front? Could you guys invade France? Churchill and FDR say, we'll do you one better. We'll invade Africa. I'm not making this stuff up. Stalin asks for a second front into France. What does the United States do? It goes into Africa with the British to fight the Germans there in North Africa. This was called the soft underbelly. The idea was the U.S. and British would save troops, save their own lives, if they attacked Germany at a weaker point, such as in Africa, drive the Germans back through Africa into Italy. The Allies then invade Italy, go up through Italy, and then ultimately work their way into Germany. In that way, it never really happens. We do drive the Soviets. We do drive the Nazis out of Africa, but we get bogged down in Italy. We're never able to work their way through. So is this just bad planning? Not really. The United States just was not ready for war. It certainly wasn't ready to take on a country like the Nazis. So, I mean, if you've seen Saving Private Ryan, or I mean, you know what the invasion of Normandy, you know what the fighting in Europe was like. And we weren't even fighting. I mean, we were fighting the Nazis like B or C Squad in places like France. Imagine. If we had, without having the experience of getting kind of battle hardened through fighting in Africa, if we had just gone into Normandy, how much worse that would have been. So it's partly that the U.S. Army just was not ready to directly take on the Nazis, even their B or C squads. We weren't able, or we weren't willing to do it. More cynically, though, for Churchill and FDR, Nazis and commies killing each other, kind of like a dream they've been having for a couple decades. So we didn't really mind that Nazis were grinding down Soviets and Soviets were pushing back on Nazis. We didn't mind that. As long as they were killing each other, they weren't killing us. And so I said this was really cynical. We don't actually open up that second front that Churchill called for about 2 years after he was asking for us to do it. But we were more than happy for the Nazis to kill a lot of Soviets, and they did. And so all that is to say, we don't exactly give the Soviets much reason to trust us either. So we exit the war on pretty uncertain grounds. Will the Soviet Union threaten the United States' global economic ambitions in the way that Hitler tried to do in the 1930s? Are the Soviets going to resist the United States? Maybe not militarily. Are they going to resist the United States economically? Particularly, what are they going to do in places like the Middle East? What are they going to do in places like Europe? Are they going to threaten Western Europe in some kind of way, in the way that Hitler did? Are they going to start World War III? The last meeting of the big three, you see pictured there, is Yalta. This will be the last meeting, just because FDR, just reelected to his fourth term, will die shortly after that. This is the last meeting between Churchill, Stalin, Uncle Joe, and FDR. Yalta seems to be a mixed blessing. A lot of people criticized FDR for not getting the Soviets to commit more definitely to a withdrawal into their own borders after the war was over. The Soviets did sign this. I'm sorry, I don't have it on the PowerPoint. A declaration of liberated Europe, where the Soviets say, "Yeah, I know we had that non-aggression pact with Germans. Yes, it's true. The Red Army is spread throughout Poland and Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. Spread throughout all of these regions because that's where the Red Army had driven the Germans back. By this point, the Red Army is even in Germany. But Stalin says we will withdraw. Once the war is over, we will ensure free elections in these countries, and we will ultimately withdraw. We won't interfere with them." But many American policymakers didn't believe the Soviets were actually going to do that. It was just this was kind of an empty piece of paper. From FDR's standpoint, he believed Yalta was a significant victory because he got the Soviets to buy into the new United Nations. He got them specifically to become part of the Security Council. Look, and here's where we need to understand the United Nations is not like the League of Nations. The League of Nations was just a universal body of states. And there wasn't really a recognition that some states were just simply more powerful than others. The United Nations is not built that way, right? The governing body of the United Nations is not the General Assembly, it's the Security Council. The Security Council the original Security Council had 5 states: U.S., Great Britain, the Soviet Union, France kind of worked their way into the end, and China. These were the countries that certainly the United States and England thought would be most important for policing the world, that these would be the most powerful states once World War II ended. And so these were the states that really had to figure out how to get along. Right. The UN is based on not a kind of Wilsonian idealism, but more of a Wilsonian realism. Some states are more important than others. Some states are more powerful than others, and they should have more say. So the General Assembly of the UN could all say the world should all wear underwear on the outside. It doesn't matter if you have 150 states all agreeing to that. All you need is one state of the Security Council saying, "Nah, we disagree," and it doesn't happen. So getting the Soviets to get into the Security Council, FDR thought, all right, in the Security Council, we'll be able to get the Soviets to, or I will be able to get the Soviets, our people will be able to get the Soviets to work with us. We had been supplying financial aid, all kinds of assistance to the Soviets during the war, and we thought, well, that will continue, and through our financial aid, through working with Uncle Joe in the Security Council, the Soviets will ultimately not resist our plans for expanding the Bretton Woods system, rebuilding free enterprise in other countries. So here's where we encounter one of those great questions in history. What difference does one person make? What difference does one personality make in world history? One of the great what ifs. What if FDR had not died shortly into his 4th term? What if he had been the president to oversee those very crucial 3 years of the post-World War II years? What if it had been him and not his vice president, Harry Truman? It's one of those great what ifs. Because the thing we know about FDR is he was incredibly pragmatic, realistic. He had a lot of experience already at time working with Stalin. There is no trust between either of them, but still there is familiarity between them. So what if it had been FDR? Would he have been able to avoid what actually happens after World War II? And with most hypotheticals, we could say we don't know if that relationship would have been able to keep up. What we do know is Harry Truman is not FDR. Harry Truman is much more rigid and flexible. the person who's done this personality work on these guys would say Harry Truman was insecure, right? He doesn't have the foreign policy experience. He's never been in those kinds of roles. He hadn't done that kind of work. And sometimes when you are insecure, you tend to overcompensate. So instead of, you're afraid of being seen as like soft or weak, and so you kind of try to project strength, masculinity, and when maybe what's needed is a little more flexibility. It became pretty clear early on that this was going to be a very different relationship. So the Soviet ambassador, the main Soviet ambassador in the United States, man named Molotov, stopped by Washington on his way to San Francisco for the United Nations conference. Molotov stopping by to the White House to pay his condolences to FDR. His death had recently occurred, and to meet the new president, Harry Truman. So they sit down together. Truman immediately starts lecturing Molotov on withdrawing from Eastern Europe, on kind of abiding by the Declaration of Liberated Europe principles. Truman just lays into him, and Molotov is getting visibly angry. Truman finishes, and Molotov, just red faced, says, "I've never been talked to that. I've never been talked to that way in my life." And Truman fires back, "Honor your agreements, and you won't get talked to that way." And it's pretty clear the relationship is not going to go well. Truman is just he's not the person for this particular moment. So again, it's one of those great questions. If it had been somebody other than Harry Truman, would we have been okay? Yeah, I haven't really thought about this before, but the guy who would have been the person meeting with Molotov actually would have been Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace from Century of the Common Man, right? At the time, from 1940 to 1944, Wallace was was FDR's vice president. It's funny, Wallace was incredibly liked by the American people, probably the most popular politician in all the country, but he was hated in Washington. More hated than not, should I say. So what if it had been Wallace? Wallace, I think, had been demoted to like Secretary of Commerce or something like that. What if it had been Wallace meeting with these individuals? Wallace has had a very different relationship with the Soviet Union, very different attitude towards the Soviet Union. So it's just one of those great personality questions. But the reality is it's Truman. Truman begins shifting American diplomacy in a different way. Instead of the dollar diplomacy, which FDR probably would have continued, dollar diplomacy meaning we're going to provide loans and recovery money for the Soviets with the hopes of getting them to continue to work with the United States through the United Nations and allowing the United States to establish the Bretton Woods system. Truman says, no, we're going to go in a different direction. Truman believes the United States has an ace in the hole, believes that they have a special thing that the Soviets don't have, that we believe will allow the United States to run the tables on the global order. What is that thing that we have that the Soviets don't have, at least in 1945? Yeah, and I assume someone said it, the atomic bomb. The historian who studied this issue said, we dropped the first bomb on Japan to send a message to Japan, you better surrender. We dropped the second bomb on Japan to send a message to the Soviet Union, you better play ball with us. In fact, the Soviets are our allies. We don't even tell Uncle Joe that we have this weapon or that we're dropping these bombs. Truman's just like, just kind of an offhand conversation at one of the first meetings between Truman and Stalin. I believe it's the Potsdam Conference in 1945. Truman says, "Oh, hey, by the way, Uncle Joe, we got this weapon of awesome power, and you're going to be seeing it in a few weeks in Apparently, Joe was like, "Oh, that's cool. Whatever works for you." Um, and then apparently he went and he apparently went and ran back to his advisors to say, "What the heck do the Americans have? Like, we need one of those things too." And of course, it turned out to be the atomic bomb. And so instead of dollar diplomacy, Truman believes atomic diplomacy will work for the United States. And the reality is, within 10 weeks of the bombing of Japan, we had plans to bomb every major Russian city. But ultimately, the Soviets don't respect our atomic diplomacy. In public, they laugh at us. They laugh at threats of the United States to use nuclear weapons against the Soviet Union. We just don't believe there's any legitimacy for doing so. In secret, the Soviets are fast-tracking their own weapons program. They will ultimately recruit spies in the United States. Those spies will deliver atomic secrets to the Soviets, and the Soviets, by 1949, will have their own atomic bomb, which they detonate. They don't tell us about it either, but we figure it out. It's kind of hard to hide that kind of thing around the planet, you know. So atomic diplomacy doesn't work. As 45 passes into 46, communication that had to be there for conducting the war effort between these two sides, it just breaks down. It's not happening. In absence of communication, I wonder sometimes if Truman had the ability to text Stalin in the middle of the night, "You up?" And they could have talked through some of these difficulties, but the technology is not there. But honestly, if there was, the will is not there. Both of these sides are pretty locked into their ideologies, their imperial ideologies, mind you, right? Both are expansionary minded. Neither side really trusts the other. And so communication is really just breaking down, leaving both sides to kind of wonder what's the other trying to do. It's in March of 1946 that Winston Churchill, now the ex-prime minister, but still an immensely popular figure in the world, Churchill traveled to Missouri, of all places, to give one of the most important speeches of the early Cold War, the Iron Curtain speech. Churchill will say, "Look, you Americans, you're wondering what the Soviets are doing. Let me tell you what they're doing. They are establishing an Iron Curtain through Eastern Europe. They're not going to respect their agreements. They're not going to allow free elections to take place in those countries. They're going to set up a barrier, a wall around these states. And once they do, curtains kind of open both ways. They're going to establish this curtain, and then if there's no resistance, they're going to keep pushing that curtain further and further into Western Europe. They're in Germany, they're going to take all of Germany. They get Germany, they're going to take France. And then we're in World War III. Churchill calls upon Americans to join him in join England in defending what he called Christian civilization against the godless Soviets. Americans in March 1946 are not ready to they're not ready to go to war again against the Soviets. But still, that Iron Curtain imagery begins to, as you see there in the middle of the screen, begins to work its way into American language and popular culture. And as 46 goes into 47, more Americans are saying, yeah, maybe Churchill's right. Maybe this is what the Soviets are trying to do. Certainly, as we move into 1947, certainly Truman and his team are pretty convinced that the Soviets are not going to go home. It's interesting in 1946 that the litmus test for the Soviets withdrawing back into their borders was actually the Middle East. The Soviets were in Iran. And the United States was initially thinking about going to war against the Soviet Union over the control of Iran. And we'll talk about that in another minute. Ultimately, the Shah is able to work out a deal with the Soviets, and the Soviets withdraw. So then the litmus test then passes to Eastern Europe. Are the Soviets going to withdraw from Eastern Europe, or are they establishing that Iron Curtain that Churchill talked about? Here's when a man named George Kennan writes a long telegram back to the United States in February of 1947. This eventually becomes known as kind of the basis of the containment doctrine. This long telegram from George Kennan, a Russian expert, he tells Truman and his team pretty much what Truman and his team had already been thinking, just Kennan says it a little bit more clearly. What Kennan suggests is, look, I know the Soviets. The Soviets are Russians. I know the Russians. The Russians are historically insecure. Every few years they get invaded, particularly by Germany, and they don't like it. And so the Russians are going to expand. They're going to expand not just because they're Soviets and they have this global ideology of communism which they're trying to spread around the world. They're going to expand because they're Russians and because they're insecure and they want some breathing room so they don't get invaded again by Germany or just the West in general, including the United States. They're going to expand if they're allowed to expand. However, if they meet an equal and opposing force, if their expansion is resisted, that insecurity is going to lead them to withdraw. They will withdraw if they are met by an equal show of force or strength. And so Kennan advises a kind of an active defense strategy. Wherever the Red Army is, the United States needs to put up some kind of counterforce against the Soviets, and with the understanding the Soviets ultimately would back down, would stop their expansion, if not eventually withdraw into their own borders. This eventually becomes known as the containment policy. We need to contain Soviet expansion. The Red Army, because of World War II, is spread throughout Eastern Europe. We need to counter that expansion so that they don't go any further, they don't start World War III, and ultimately put pressure on them to withdraw. Again, it's not like Truman and his team were sitting around twiddling their thumbs. Oh, what do we do? What do we do? And then they read Kennan's telegram and said, oh, that's what we need to do. Kennan just kind of crystallized everybody's thinking. Truman and his team had already been thinking that they needed to do something to send a message to the Soviets that their occupation of Eastern Europe was illegal, illegitimate in an international sense. The Soviets needed to go home. They needed to do something. And Kennan kind of provided that rationale. Ultimately, the British come to the United States in early March of 1947 and say, "Hey, we got this problem." England had been kind of the chief world policeman, if you will, for many different spots, but that included Greece and Turkey. And they say, "Look, Greece and Turkey are having some serious problems here. We don't have the money to help them out. Could you guys pump some money, like a couple $100 million into Greece and Turkey?" Greece was kind of in civil war at the time. Turkey was being threatened by the Soviets. That was an actual Soviet question. The Greece one wasn't really, but they were kind of lumped together. And England said to the United States, "Hey, could you give a couple $100 million to these states to kind of help them out?" And Truman said, "All right, so this is the moment when U.S. policy regarding the Soviet Union needs to solidify. Right? We need to settle things down." So this occasion of asking Congress for $400 million to give to Greece and Turkey becomes the occasion for Truman to issue America's, well, to call it Cold War policy suggests the Cold War is already underway. In many ways, the Truman Doctrine speech that Truman will give, in many ways, inaugurates, solidifies this conflict, lays out the parameters of it. So I'm not going to go in and talk at length about the Truman Doctrine speech because that is your exercise. You're going to be listening to that and you're going to be commenting on it. I will say I do want to point out a few things for you to think about as you listen to this. Hopefully you'll listen to this first and then go do the exercise. Even if you do the exercise first, this will help kind of clear your thinking on this. A couple things about that speech to consider. So as I said, the context of this speech, Truman going to Congress and saying, hey, we need this money for Greece and Turkey, kind of begs the question, why are we concerned about Greece and Turkey? Is it because, well, as we've talked about at the beginning of this lecture, we're very concerned about the Greece and the Turkey market. We're very concerned about Greeks and Turks buying U.S. goods in the future, and so we need their economic stability. Is that why we were concerned about Greece and Turkey, or is it possible that there's some other reason or motivation for being concerned about Greece and Turkey? Why Britain would be concerned and why the United States would be concerned? And so maybe look at them on the map and think about Greece and Turkey and kind of what they're close to and what the United States might be kind of worried about. And we can talk more about this in lecture. Feel free to ask me questions about it, but I think you might be able to figure it out too, especially as you listen to the speech. If you make it far enough into the speech, you'll hear Harry Truman talking about, he's not going to use the phrase domino theory, but you're going to see the domino theory instituted there as part of the logic of his speech, and it has everything to do with Greece and Turkey. Greece and Turkey in some ways being considered the first of the dominoes. So that's something to keep in mind. Something else was a passage of the Truman Doctrine speech that you will not hear because ultimately Truman decided to take it out. And I have to paraphrase this. I have to do it from memory because I don't have my lecture notes anymore. But an original draft of the Truman Doctrine speech said this. The free enterprise system is disappearing two world wars and an intervening depression have weakened the free enterprise system everywhere around the world. If we allow the free enterprise system to disappear around the world, it threatens the very nature of our democracy. It's interesting that he conflates free enterprise with democracy there. Ultimately, Truman cuts that part out of his speech. He said it sounded too much like an investment prospectus. Instead, he decides that he needs to play up the Soviet threat. I think I said in the assignment for this, one of his advisors, the Senator Vanderburg, said, "Harry, you need to scare hell out of the American people." Decides to make this maybe a scarier speech, if you will, instead of a speech that talked about kind of the economic realities of the situation at that time. So as you listen to the Truman Doctrine speech, maybe keep those two things in mind. But here's kind of my big point before we take a break and move into the actual policies of America's early Cold War. America has two major uncertainties coming out of World War II. One, how do we keep our economy, now having recovered and unprecedented in productivity, how do we keep the American economy running at full steam? And the second question was, will the Soviets stand in our way as we look to expand or rebuild and expand free enterprise around the world? Understand how the second question becomes the answer to the first question. Okay? Were the Soviets actually going to stand in our way of capitalist or free enterprise rebuilding and expansion? Absolutely they were. Absolutely they were. Were they going to start World War III? The evidence very much is against it. Look, the Soviets lost 30 million people winning World War II, and I stress winning World War II. We lost 500,000 people. They lost 30 million people. The Soviets have a greater stake to saying they're the ones who liberated Europe from Nazi domination. not the Americans. They lost 30 million people, 70,000 cities and towns destroyed. Even if they wanted to start World War III, they couldn't. Certainly Stalin was not going to. All the policies that we're aware of suggest that Stalin was trying to close the door of Eastern Europe and particularly the Soviet Union to foreign influence. One thing he did. Russian POWs, when they were taken captive by Germans, for instance, when they were returned to the Soviet Union, Stalin had them killed. He was afraid they had too much contact with the world outside of Russia. They couldn't be trusted, and so he had them killed. Yeah. Stalin's a bad guy. He's not Uncle Joe. He's a pretty awful guy, in case you were wondering. But that suggests that his priorities were not this kind of global domination. I mean, there were people in his party, certainly, that were pushing the hard ideological line, but that's not Stalin. Stalin's primary concern was stabilizing the Soviet Union, particularly stabilizing his control over the Soviet Union. Now, if that's true, his calculation regarding Eastern Europe was a mistake. If he thought that he could hold on to Eastern European countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia and not risk the ire of the United States or the suspicion of the United States, he proved wrong. He proved wrong. But the reality is that there's very little evidence that the Soviets were actually going to start World War III. But it didn't matter. From a U.S. standpoint, it didn't matter whether the Soviets' threat was real or imagined. The Soviet threat, both real and imagined to American interests, provided the justification for the United States to go about pursuing its primary post-war interest. Our primary post-war interest, now I realize this conflicts with a lot of the history you probably learned. It conflicts with how many Americans even talk about the Cold War. But the reality is our primary concern after World War II was not stopping Soviet aggression. Our primary concern after World War II was securing the American economy at its unprecedentedly high level. It was securing American prosperity, which secures America's domestic stability. That is our primary concern. We don't want to be back in a situation like the Great Depression, with millions of people cut loose from the state, and who knows what they might do. Or who knows who they might be influenced by. We don't want to go back we don't want to go back. We want to move forward. In a nationally integrated economy, which demands an internationally integrated economy, which means having to rebuild our allies and build new allies around the world who are committed to free economies, to low tariffs, to an open door, basically. This will help the United States, but we believe it would help other countries as well as be conducive to world peace. Ultimately, understand how the Soviet threat, real and imagined, gave the occasion for the United States to engage in policies that would allow it to pursue its primary post-war interest. America's primary post-war interest is not stopping Soviet aggression. Our primary goal after World War II is securing America's economic future and thus its internal political stability. We'll see how this plays out in terms of American Cold War policies in the next lecture. Thanks for coming along with me so far.